George Williams sat in his small apartment staring at his phone. The screen was dark and empty. No messages, no calls, nothing. His wife Margaret walked into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. She looked at her husband and knew exactly what he was thinking. Their children had forgotten them again. It had been 3 months since any of them had called or visited. Linda was busy with her law firm in New York. Patrick was running his tech company in California. Kenneth was traveling somewhere in Europe for his consulting job. All 3 of them were successful. All 3 of them had been raised by George and Margaret, with every bit of love and sacrifice 2 people could give. But now those children were gone, not dead, just absent, which somehow felt worse. George was 68 years old. Margaret was 66. They had worked their entire lives to give their adoptive children everything. George had spent 30 years working double shifts at the factory. His back hurt every morning. His knees ached when he climbed stairs. Margaret had cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs. Her hands were rough and scarred from years of scrubbing and washing. They had saved every penny they could for their children's education. Linda had gone to Columbia University. Patrick had studied at Stanford. Kenneth had earned his degree from Georgetown. The couple had nothing left in their savings account. They had given it all away to create opportunities for 3 children who no longer remembered their phone numbers. The final moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. George had received a medical bill for $8,000. His insurance had denied coverage for a procedure on his heart. He was scared. He needed help. So he did something he hated doing. He called Patrick. His son's secretary answered the phone. George explained who he was and why he was calling. The secretary put him on hold. 15 minutes passed. Then she came back on the line and said that Patrick was too busy to take calls from people asking for money. George felt something break inside his chest. It wasn't his heart condition. It was something deeper. He thanked the secretary and hung up. He never told Margaret about that call. He didn't need to. She could see it in his eyes. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, scrolling through her phone, trying to distract herself from the pain. She found herself looking at real estate listings. Not in the city, not in the suburbs, but far away in the mountains. She didn't know why she was looking. They couldn't afford to move. They could barely afford to stay where they were. But something made her keep scrolling. Then she saw it. A cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. The listing said it was a fixer-upper. The photos showed a building that was barely standing. The roof had collapsed on one side. The windows were broken or missing. The porch had rotted through. Vines and weeds covered everything. It looked like it had been abandoned for 20 years. Maybe longer. The price was $12,000. That was almost exactly what George and Margaret had left in their account after paying rent and bills. Margaret showed George the listing in the morning. He looked at the photos for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at his wife. They both knew what the other was thinking. This was crazy. They were too old to fix up a ruined cabin in the middle of nowhere. They had health problems. They had no construction experience. They had no family to help them. But they also had nothing keeping them in the city. Their children didn't want them. Their friends had moved away or passed on. Their apartment was small and depressing. The medical bills kept coming. They were slowly drowning in a life that had stopped giving them any reason to keep swimming. George made the call to the real estate agent that afternoon. The cabin and 5 acres of land could be theirs for $12,000 cash. No inspection needed, no guarantees given. The agent warned them that the property was in terrible condition. George said they understood. They signed the papers 2 weeks later. They sold their furniture. They sold everything except what could fit in their old pickup truck. They packed their clothes, their tools, their photos, and their hope into boxes and bags. They didn't tell their children they were leaving. There was no point. Linda, Patrick, and Kenneth wouldn't notice they were gone. On a cold morning in March, George and Margaret drove out of the city for the last time. The truck was overloaded and struggling up the highway. They drove for 6 hours into the mountains. The roads got smaller and rougher. They passed through tiny towns that looked forgotten by time. Finally, they turned onto a dirt road that climbed up into the forest. The road was full of holes and rocks. Tree branches scraped the sides of the truck. After 2 miles, they reached a clearing. This was their property. This was their new home. George turned off the engine. They both sat in silence, looking at the cabin through the windshield. It looked worse in person than in the photos. Much worse. The entire structure was leaning to one side. The front door was missing. Animals had clearly been living inside. The clearing was overgrown with thorns and poison ivy. There was no electricity, no running water, no neighbors for miles. Margaret started crying. Not loud sobbing, but quiet tears that ran down her face. George reached over and took her hand. His own eyes were wet. They had given up everything for this. A ruined cabin on a forgotten mountain. They had been abandoned by their children, and now they had abandoned civilization itself. They were alone. They were old. They were scared. But they were together. And somewhere deep inside both of them, beneath the fear and doubt, was a tiny spark of something else, something that refused to die. It was the same thing that had kept them working all those years. The same thing that had pushed them through poverty and racism and heartbreak. It was the stubborn human refusal to give up, to lie down, to quit. George squeezed Margaret's hand and said they should set up their tent before it got dark. They would start working on the cabin tomorrow. Margaret wiped her tears and nodded. They climbed out of the truck and began unloading their supplies. The mountain wind was cold and sharp. The forest around them was dark and full of strange sounds. But George and Margaret worked together in silence, setting up their camp. They had survived worse than this. They had raised 3 children from nothing. They had built lives from scratch before. They could do it again. They had to, because there was nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. This ruined cabin on this forgotten mountain was their last chance, their final stand, and they were going to make it work or die trying. The first night was brutal. George and Margaret lay in their tent listening to sounds they had never heard before. Strange animal calls echoed through the darkness. Something large moved through the bushes near their camp. The temperature dropped below freezing. Their sleeping bags were not warm enough. Margaret's arthritis flared up in the cold, making her hands and knees throb with pain. George's breathing was labored in the thin mountain air. His heart felt like it was working too hard. They barely slept. When dawn finally came, they crawled out of the tent exhausted and sore. Their breath made clouds in the frigid morning air. George made coffee on their camping stove while Margaret walked around the property in the early light. The cabin looked even worse in daylight. She could see straight through holes in the walls. The chimney had partially collapsed. The foundation was crumbling in several places. She walked carefully onto what remained of the porch. The wood groaned and bent under her weight. Inside the cabin was a disaster. Years of rain and snow had rotted everything. The floor was covered in leaves and animal droppings. Birds had nested in the exposed rafters. A family of raccoons had made a home in what used to be the kitchen. The smell was overwhelming. Margaret backed out carefully and returned to where George was sitting by the camping stove. She sat down next to him without saying anything. They both knew what she had found. This was impossible. They were 2 elderly people with bad health and no help. They couldn't rebuild this cabin. They couldn't survive a winter here. They had made a terrible mistake, but neither of them said these thoughts out loud. Instead, they drank their coffee and ate granola bars and tried to figure out what to do first. George decided they needed to clear the cabin interior before anything else. They needed to see what they were working with. So they put on work gloves and face masks and went inside. They spent the entire day hauling trash and debris out of the building. Broken furniture, rotted curtains, piles of leaves and branches, dead animals in nests. Everything went into a pile outside. By the end of the day, they had filled a space the size of a car with garbage. Their bodies were screaming in protest. George had to stop every 30 minutes to catch his breath. Margaret's hands were so swollen she could barely close them. They heated up canned soup for dinner and ate in silence. Then they crawled into their tent and passed out from exhaustion. The next day was worse. And the day after that, and the day after that. Every morning they woke up in pain. Every day they worked until they couldn't move. Every night they collapsed into their tent, wondering if they would even wake up the next morning. George collapsed twice in the first week, once while carrying a beam outside, once while trying to nail boards over a broken window. Both times Margaret had to help him to the ground and make him rest. She was terrified he was going to have a heart attack and die out here with no hospital for 50 miles. But George always got back up after resting. Always went back to work. Margaret's arthritis got so bad she spent one entire day unable to use her hands at all. She sat on a stump crying from frustration while George worked alone. But the next day she was back at it. pushing through the pain, refusing to stop. Something strange started happening around the end of the second week. Their bodies began to adapt. George noticed he wasn't getting out of breath as quickly. The mountain air was clean and pure. His lungs were getting stronger. Margaret noticed her joints didn't hurt as much when she kept moving. The constant activity was actually helping her arthritis instead of making it worse. They were still in pain, still exhausted, but they were getting tougher, stronger. Their soft city bodies were remembering how to do hard physical work, how to endure. They started sleeping better, eating better, thinking more clearly. The mountain was harsh, but it was also healing them in ways they didn't understand. By the end of the first month, they had accomplished something remarkable. The cabin interior was completely cleared. They had patched the worst holes in the roof using salvaged wood and plastic tarps. They had installed a basic wood stove they bought from a hardware store in the nearest town. They had covered all the windows with plywood until they could afford real glass. The cabin was still a wreck, but it was a wreck they could sleep in. They moved out of their tent and into the cabin. That first night sleeping under a real roof felt like a miracle. The wood stove kept them warm. The wind couldn't reach them. They had walls and a door. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Real progress that they had made with their own hands. George started keeping a journal documenting everything they did. What worked? What didn't? How much things cost? How long projects took? Margaret started making lists of everything they needed to fix. Everything they needed to learn. Everything they needed to survive. They had no plan when they arrived. Now they were starting to develop one. They needed a reliable water source. They needed better insulation. They needed a way to generate electricity. They needed to grow food. The list was overwhelming, but they broke it down into small pieces. One project at a time. One day at a time. One nail at a time. The town was called Pine Ridge and it had about 800 people. George and Margaret drove there once a week for supplies. The hardware store, the grocery store, the gas station. People stared at them. An elderly black couple buying construction supplies and camping gear, loading everything into a beat-up truck, driving back into the mountains. The locals were curious but not unfriendly. A few people asked what they were doing up there. George told them they were fixing up the old Morton place. The Morton cabin had been abandoned for 30 years. Everyone in town knew about it. Most people thought it should be torn down. When George said they were rebuilding it to live in, people looked at him like he was crazy. Maybe he was, but he was committed now. They both were. Money was tight. They had spent almost everything buying the property. What little remained had to cover food, gas, and building supplies. They couldn't afford to hire help. Couldn't afford professional tools. Couldn't afford mistakes. George learned to scavenge materials from old buildings and junkyards. He learned to fix broken tools. He learned to make do with whatever they had. Margaret learned to cook on the wood stove, learned to preserve food, learned which wild plants were edible and which were poisonous. They were learning skills their grandparents would have known, skills the modern world had forgotten, skills that might keep them alive. 3 months in, George was digging a trench to bury a water line from the creek to the cabin. His shovel hit something hard. He thought it was a rock, but when he cleared the dirt away, he saw metal. A metal box buried about 3 feet deep. He called Margaret over. Together they dug it out. The box was old and rusted but still sealed. They carried it inside and pried it open carefully. Inside were papers wrapped in oilcloth, documents, maps, a journal. Everything was dated from the 1890s. George and Margaret looked at each other in shock. Someone had lived here before, long before, and they had buried these things for a reason. Margaret carefully unfolded the first document. The paper was brown with age but still readable. It was a land deed dated August 1891. The property had been claimed by a family named Morton, Samuel and Grace Morton. Former slaves who had walked north after the war ended. They had homesteaded this land under the Homestead Act. 5 acres of mountain wilderness that nobody else wanted. The deed was signed and official. These people had owned this land legally, had built this cabin with their own hands, had started a new life here in the mountains far from the plantations that had stolen their youth. George found the journal. The handwriting was careful and neat. Samuel Morton had written entries almost every day for years. He described clearing the land, building the cabin, planting crops, raising chickens and goats. The entries were matter of fact. No complaints, no self-pity. Just a record of work done and problem solved. Samuel wrote about digging a root cellar into the hillside, about finding a spring that flowed year-round, about planting apple and pear trees, about building a smokehouse for preserving meat. Every entry was another piece of evidence that a family had not just survived here but thrived. Margaret found maps drawn by hand. They showed the property in detail, where the spring was located, where the fruit trees had been planted, where the root cellar was dug, where the garden beds were laid out. There were notes written in the margins explaining everything: how deep to dig the cellar, how to divert the spring water, which trees produced the best fruit. It was like finding an instruction manual written specifically for this land. Samuel and Grace Morton had figured out how to live here, how to work with the mountain instead of against it, and they had left these instructions buried for whoever came next. George spread the maps out on their makeshift table. He compared them to the current property. Most of the features Samuel had drawn were still there, hidden, overgrown, but still there. The spring was exactly where the map said it would be. About 200 yards uphill from the cabin, George and Margaret had been hauling water from the creek a quarter-mile away. The whole time there was fresh spring water much closer. They just hadn't known where to look. The root cellar was there too, buried under 30 years of soil and vegetation. The fruit trees had gone wild, but they were still alive, still producing fruit that fell and rotted every year because nobody was there to harvest it. Margaret sat down and cried. Not from sadness, from something else. Connection, maybe. Or recognition. Samuel and Grace Morton had been just like them. People who had been discarded by the world. People who had nothing but each other and a determination to survive. They had come to this mountain with even less than George and Margaret had. No truck, no tools, no money, just freedom and a piece of paper saying this land was theirs. And they had built something lasting. Something real. The cabin George and Margaret were fixing was the same cabin Samuel had built with his own hands in 1891. They were living inside history, inside a legacy. George started reading the journal out loud. Samuel wrote about the first winter, how brutal it was, how they almost starved, how Grace got sick and nearly died. But they survived. They learned. They adapted. The second year was better. The third year better still. By the fifth year, they were comfortable. They had food stored, animals raised, a garden producing. They had turned raw wilderness into a home. Samuel wrote about other black families who had tried to homestead nearby. Some succeeded, some gave up and moved to town, some died. The mountain didn't care about your race or your history. It only cared whether you were tough enough and smart enough to survive. The last entry in the journal was dated 1907. Samuel wrote that he was getting old. His hands hurt too much to work. Grace had passed on 2 years earlier. He was leaving the property to go live with his daughter in Tennessee. He was burying these documents for whoever came next, whoever tried to make a life on this mountain. He wanted them to know the history, to know what was possible, to learn from his mistakes and build on his successes. He ended the entry with a simple line that hit George like a punch to the chest. If we could do it, so can you. George and Margaret spent the next 3 days exploring the property with Samuel's maps. They found the spring exactly where it was marked. Clear, cold water flowing out of the rocks. Enough water to supply 10 families. They found the root cellar dug into the hillside. The entrance was completely covered, but the stone walls inside were still solid. They found apple trees, pear trees, cherry trees scattered through the forest. Old and gnarled but still producing fruit. They found the remains of the smokehouse, the outline of the original garden beds, the stone foundation of what might have been a chicken coop. Everything Samuel had built was still here, waiting, sleeping, ready to be awakened. They returned to the cabin that night with a completely new understanding of what they were doing. This wasn't just about fixing up an old building. This was about restoring a legacy, honoring the work of people who had come before. Samuel and Grace Morton had proven it was possible to build a life here. They had documented everything, left instructions, left encouragement. Now it was George and Margaret's turn to pick up where Samuel had left off. To finish what he started. To prove that the human spirit could overcome anything if it refused to quit. George began following Samuel's plans exactly. He cleared the path to the spring and installed a pipe to bring water directly to the cabin. He dug out the root cellar and reinforced the entrance. He pruned the fruit trees and fertilized them. He marked out the garden beds in the same location Samuel had used. Every decision Samuel had made had been for a reason. The spring was on high ground, so water would flow downhill naturally. The root cellar faced north so it stayed cool even in summer. The garden beds were positioned to get maximum sunlight. Samuel had been a genius, a practical engineer who understood the land better than any textbook could teach. Margaret started, experimenting with the wild plants growing around the property. She used Samuel's notes about which ones were edible, which ones had medicinal properties, which ones attracted pollinators for the garden. She made teas and salves and dried herbs. She was learning skills that had been passed down through generations but had almost been lost. Samuel's wife Grace had written some notes in the margins of the journal, recipes and remedies. Margaret followed them exactly. They worked. Everything worked, because these weren't theories. They were proven techniques developed through years of trial and error. The work took on new meaning. Every nail George drove was connecting him to Samuel. Every plant Margaret cultivated was honoring Grace. They were no longer alone on this mountain. They were part of a story that stretched back over a century, part of a tradition of people who refused to be defeated, who took nothing and made it into something, who survived when everyone expected them to fail. George and Margaret had thought they were starting from zero, but they weren't. They were starting from all the knowledge and experience Samuel and Grace had accumulated. They were standing on the shoulders of giants. 6 months after finding the buried box, the property was transformed. Water flowed from the spring through pipes George had installed. The root cellar was clean and ready to store food. The fruit trees were pruned and healthy. A vegetable garden was growing in the exact spot where Samuel's garden had grown. The cabin was weatherproof and warm. George and Margaret had running water, a reliable heat source, and enough food stored to last through winter. They had done in 6 months what took Samuel and Grace 5 years. Because Samuel had left them a map, had shown them the way, had believed that someone would come after him and continue the work. George added his own entry to Samuel's journal. He wrote about finding the cabin in ruins, about the fear and doubt, about discovering the buried documents, about following Samuel's plans and watching everything work perfectly. He wrote that he and Margaret had been abandoned by their children, that they had come to this mountain with broken hearts and broken bodies. But the mountain and Samuel's wisdom had healed them, had given them purpose, had shown them they were stronger than they knew. He ended his entry the same way Samuel had ended his. If we could do it, so can you. Then he wrapped the journal and documents carefully and put them back in the metal box. Someday they would bury it again for whoever came next. The chain would continue. The legacy would live on. 1 year after arriving at the mountain, George Williams stood in front of the cabin and barely recognized it. The sagging wreck they had found was gone. In its place stood a solid structure with a new roof, insulated walls, and real windows. Solar panels George had installed gleamed on the south-facing slope of the roof. A water line from the spring fed into a tank that supplied the cabin with clean running water. The clearing around the cabin had been transformed into productive gardens and orchards. It looked like a different place. It was a different place. George himself was different too. The man who had struggled to climb stairs a year ago now hiked miles through the forest every day without breathing hard. His doctor in Pine Ridge had been shocked during his last checkup. George's blood pressure was normal. His heart function had improved dramatically. He had lost 30 pounds of fat and gained muscle. At 69 years old, he was in better shape than he had been at 50. The mountain had stripped away the weakness and revealed the strength underneath. The clean air, the physical work, the simple food, the absence of stress, all of it had combined to heal him in ways medicine never could. Margaret was equally transformed. Her arthritis had improved so much she barely thought about it anymore. Her hands were strong and capable. She could work in the garden for hours without pain. She had lost weight too and gained an energy she hadn't felt in decades. At 67, she felt younger than she had at 60. The constant movement had been the cure. Not rest, not pills, but daily purposeful activity. Her mind was sharper too. She had learned so much in the past year. Plant identification, food preservation, natural medicine, sustainable living. She had become an expert through necessity and practice. The cabin interior was comfortable and efficient. George had built furniture from salvaged wood. A table and chairs, a bed frame, shelves and cabinets. Everything was simple but well made. The wood stove kept the space warm even on the coldest nights. Oil lamps provided light when the solar power ran low. They had a small refrigerator that ran on solar power, a 2-burner propane stove for cooking when they didn't want to use the wood stove. It wasn't luxury, but it was comfortable. More importantly, it was theirs. Every board and nail, every system and solution, they had built it with their own hands, and it felt like the first real home they had ever owned. The gardens were Margaret's pride. She had spent months preparing the soil, amending it with compost made from their food scraps and forest materials. She had planted vegetables in raised beds built from logs. Tomatoes, beans, squash, peppers, lettuce, carrots, potatoes, onions. Everything grew abundantly in the rich mountain soil. She had established herb gardens in spiral patterns that saved space and looked beautiful. Basil, oregano, thyme, mint, chamomile, lavender. She used the herbs for cooking and medicine. The fruit trees were producing again after years of neglect. Apples, pears, cherries. Margaret had learned to preserve everything. Canning, drying, fermenting, freezing. Their root cellar was stocked with jars and containers of food they had grown and put up themselves. They could survive for months without going to town if they needed to. George had built a workshop from salvaged materials and logs he had cut himself. Inside, he had collected tools from yard sales and auctions. He had learned basic carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, and mechanics. Not from books or classes. From doing. From making mistakes and figuring out how to fix them. He made furniture to sell at the farmer's market in Pine Ridge. Simple, sturdy pieces that people appreciated. The money helped cover their expenses. But more than that, it gave George a sense of purpose. He was creating things of value, contributing. The factory job he had worked for 30 years had never felt meaningful. This did. They had become completely self-reliant. Their only regular expenses were property taxes, occasional supplies, and gas for the truck. No mortgage, no rent, no utility bills. They generated their own power, collected their own water, grew their own food, heated with wood from the forest. It was the freest they had ever felt. Not having to depend on systems or institutions or other people, they had discovered that most of what the modern world sold as necessary was actually optional. You didn't need much to live well, just clean water, healthy food, shelter, and purpose. The pain of being abandoned by their children had faded into something more like acceptance. George and Margaret rarely talked about Linda, Patrick, or Kenneth anymore. Those people seemed like characters from another life, a life that had been comfortable but hollow. A life spent working to please others, to provide for others, to serve others. This life was different. They worked for themselves, provided for themselves. The satisfaction was deeper, more real. They had poured 30 years into raising children who walked away. Now they were pouring their energy into land that gave back everything they invested. The trade was worth it. One evening, Margaret was picking tomatoes when George came up behind her. He put his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. They stood like that, watching the sun set over the mountains. The sky turned orange and pink and purple. Birds sang their evening songs. A cool breeze carried the smell of pine and earth. Margaret leaned back against her husband and felt completely content. Not happy in the shallow way happiness was usually meant, but deeply satisfied. At peace, they had lost so much, but they had found something more valuable. They had found themselves, found out what they were capable of, found a life that made sense. George said he had been thinking about their children. Margaret tensed slightly, waiting for the pain to return. But George said he had realized something. The abandonment had been a gift. If Linda, Patrick, and Kenneth had stayed involved, George and Margaret would have stayed in the city. They would have kept trying to be useful, kept hoping for scraps of attention. They would have slowly faded away in that apartment, waiting for their lives to matter to someone. Instead, the abandonment had forced them to save themselves, to discover strengths they didn't know they had. to build something meaningful. George said he actually felt grateful. Margaret thought about it and realized she felt the same way. The worst thing that had happened to them had become the best thing. It had set them free. They started talking about the future. What would happen to this place when they were gone? They had no biological children, no family they were close to. The property would probably be sold at auction after they died. Some developer would tear down the cabin and build vacation homes. Samuel Morton's legacy would be erased. Everything they had restored would be destroyed. The thought made them both sad. This land deserved better. It deserved to continue teaching people what it had taught them. That you could start over at any age. That you could build a good life with your own hands. That self-reliance and hard work could heal almost any wound. Margaret suggested they could teach others what they had learned. Invite people to visit, show them the systems they had built, share Samuel's wisdom, share their own experience. George liked the idea but worried about their privacy. They had come here to escape people, to be alone, but Margaret pointed out they weren't running anymore. They had nothing to hide from, nothing to fear. They had built something worth sharing, something that could help others the way Samuel's journal had helped them. George agreed to think about it. That night he wrote in Samuel's journal about their idea, about possibly opening the property to visitors who wanted to learn sustainable living. He wondered what Samuel would think of that. Then he smiled. He knew exactly what Samuel would think. Samuel had buried his knowledge specifically so others could learn from it. He would approve. The first snow fell in November. George and Margaret watched it from their warm cabin. The wood stove was glowing. Jars of preserved food lined the shelves. Water flowed from the tap. Lights powered by the sun illuminated the room. They had made it. 1 full year on the mountain. 1 full cycle of seasons. They had survived and done more than survive. They had thrived. As the snow fell harder, covering the ground in white, Margaret made tea from herbs she had grown and dried. George added another log to the stove. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the storm through their window. 2 elderly people who had been thrown away like garbage. 2 people who had refused to disappear. 2 people who had turned ruin into paradise through nothing but stubborn determination and love for each other. They were still here. They would always be here. This mountain was their home now, and no one could ever take that away from them. The young man appeared at the edge of the clearing on a cold morning in early spring. George was splitting firewood when he noticed the stranger standing there, looking exhausted and lost. The man was in his early 20s, wearing expensive hiking gear that was now dirty and torn. He had a backpack that looked too heavy for his thin frame. George set down his axe and walked over carefully. The young man introduced himself as Danny. He had been hiking the trails for 3 days and gotten completely turned around. He was out of food and water. His phone was dead. He had no idea where he was. Margaret came out of the cabin when she heard voices. She took one look at Danny and went into caretaker mode. She brought him inside, sat him down, and made him drink water slowly. Then she heated up vegetable soup and made him eat. Danny was so hungry he almost cried when he tasted real food. While he ate, George studied a trail map and figured out where Danny had gone wrong. The trail system had changed since Danny's map was printed. He had been walking in circles for 2 days. George explained how to get back to the main trail. It was about 5 miles, but all downhill. Danny would make it before dark if he started soon. But Danny didn't leave right away. He was looking around the cabin with amazement. He asked George and Margaret how long they had lived here. George said about 18 months. Danny couldn't believe it. He said the place looked like something from a magazine about sustainable living. The solar panels, the wood stove, the preserved food, the handmade furniture. Everything was so well organized and functional. He asked if they had hired contractors to build all this. George laughed and said no. They had done everything themselves. Danny looked at them in shock. Margaret was sitting in her chair mending clothes. George was 70 years old with gray hair and weathered hands. These were not people you would expect to build a homestead from scratch. Danny asked if he could stay a bit longer and learn about their systems. George and Margaret looked at each other. They had talked about sharing their knowledge but hadn't actually done it yet. Danny seemed sincere, respectful. He wasn't trying to take anything. He just wanted to learn. Margaret said he could stay until the next morning if he helped with chores. Danny eagerly agreed. He spent the rest of the day following George around asking questions. How did the solar panels work? Where did the water come from? How did they preserve food without electricity? George answered everything patiently. He found he enjoyed teaching, enjoyed seeing someone else appreciate what they had built. That evening, Danny sat with them for dinner. Margaret had made stew from vegetables she had canned and bread she had baked in the wood stove. Danny said it was the best meal he had ever eaten. Then he started talking about himself. He had dropped out of college 6 months ago. He was depressed and directionless. His parents were disappointed in him. He felt like a failure. He had come to the mountains to think, to figure out what to do with his life. But mostly he had just been running away. George listened without judgment. He understood running away. He understood feeling like a failure. He told Danny about their children, about being abandoned, about coming to this mountain with nothing but desperation and each other. Danny listened with his mouth open. He couldn't believe these two elderly people had overcome so much, had built so much. He said they were amazing. Margaret said they were just stubborn. Danny left the next morning but asked if he could come back. George said yes. Danny returned 2 weeks later with his girlfriend Lisa. She was a photography student. George and Margaret agreed to let her take photos of the property for a school project. Lisa spent hours photographing the cabin, the gardens, the solar panels, the workshop. She captured George splitting wood and Margaret working in the garden. She asked them to tell their story. Margaret talked about the abandonment. George talked about finding Samuel Morton's journal. They showed Lisa the metal box with the original documents. Lisa was in tears by the end. She said this was the most powerful story she had ever heard. Real people overcoming real hardship through determination and love. Lisa asked permission to share the photos and story online. George and Margaret were hesitant. They didn't want attention, didn't want to become some internet sensation, but Lisa promised to be respectful, to focus on the message, not the spectacle. She said people needed to see what was possible, needed to know that age and hardship didn't have to define you, that you could start over and build something beautiful. Margaret finally agreed on one condition. Lisa had to include Samuel Morton's story too. Had to honor the legacy that made everything possible. Lisa promised she would. 2 weeks later, Lisa posted the story on her photography blog. She had a small following of a few hundred people. The post got shared twice, then 20 times, then 200 times. Within 3 days, it had been shared thousands of times across multiple platforms. News websites picked it up. Television stations called. Magazines wanted interviews. George and Margaret's phone started ringing constantly. Emails poured in. People from all over the country wanted to visit, to learn, to meet the elderly couple who had turned abandonment into triumph. George and Margaret were completely overwhelmed. They had lived in isolation for 18 months. Now suddenly the whole world wanted to talk to them. They discussed unplugging everything and going back into silence. But the messages they received made that impossible. Young people wrote saying the story had inspired them to not give up. Elderly people wrote saying they thought their useful years were over, but now they saw possibilities. People dealing with family rejection wrote saying George and Margaret gave them hope. The messages were heartbreaking and beautiful. People were hurting, searching, lost, and somehow this story of two forgotten people on a forgotten mountain was helping them. George and Margaret realized they had a responsibility, not to be celebrities, but to share what they had learned. To honor Samuel's legacy by passing it forward, they made a decision. 1 weekend per month they would allow visitors. Small groups only. People who genuinely wanted to learn about sustainable living and self-reliance. No tourists. No cameras unless approved. Just sincere people willing to work and listen. George set up a simple website with Lisa's help. He posted the rules and dates. Within hours, all the slots for the next 6 months were filled. They were getting requests from people in other countries. George limited it to people who could travel to the property themselves. This wasn't a resort. This was a working homestead. People who came needed to understand that. The first official workshop happened on a warm Saturday in May. 12 people arrived. Young and old, different races and backgrounds. All of them had read the story. All of them wanted to learn. George showed them the solar power system, the water collection, the root cellar, the workshop. Margaret taught them about the garden, the medicinal herbs, food preservation, sustainable practices. The visitors took notes, asked questions. helped with chores. At lunch, everyone sat together eating food from the garden. The conversation was deep and real. People shared their own struggles, their own dreams of simpler lives, of self-sufficiency, of meaning beyond money and status. One woman named Helen was 73 years old. She told George and Margaret that she thought her life was basically over. Her husband had died. Her children were busy. She spent her days watching television and waiting to die. Then she read their story. She realized she still had time, still had strength. She was planning to sell her house and buy land, start her own homestead. She thanked them for showing her it was possible. Margaret hugged her and cried. This was why they had to share. This was Samuel's legacy continuing. Proof that you could overcome anything if you refused to quit. By the end of the day, the visitors were exhausted but energized. Several of them said it was the most meaningful day they had experienced in years. They had learned practical skills, but more importantly, they had learned a philosophy. That hard work healed. That self-reliance was freedom. That age was just a number. That being discarded by others didn't mean you were worthless. It meant you were free to discover your true worth. As the visitors left, each one thanked George and Margaret. Several were crying. One young man named Carlos asked if he could come back and volunteer. George said they would think about it. That night, George and Margaret sat on their porch exhausted. Hosting 12 people had been harder than they expected, but it had also been fulfilling. They had shared Samuel's wisdom, their own experience. They had helped people, given them hope and knowledge. Margaret said she thought Samuel would be proud. George agreed. He also thought their children might see the news coverage eventually, might realize what their parents had accomplished. Part of him hoped they would. Part of him didn't care anymore. The opinion of Linda, Patrick, and Kenneth didn't matter like it used to. George and Margaret had built something that mattered to hundreds of strangers. That was more valuable than the approval of 3 people who had chosen to walk away. As the stars came out above the mountains, George took Margaret's hand. They sat in silence watching the night sky. 2 people who had been abandoned, who had nearly broken, who had instead become teachers and inspirations. Their paradise was no longer just theirs. It was becoming a beacon for everyone who needed to know that starting over was always possible. The black sedan looked completely out of place on the dirt road leading to the cabin. George noticed it first. He was working in the garden when he heard the engine struggling over the rough terrain. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line she had strung between 2 trees. They both stopped what they were doing and watched the car approach. Visitors always came on workshop weekends and always in groups. This was a Tuesday afternoon, and the car was alone. When it stopped and the door opened, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It was Linda, their oldest daughter, the lawyer from New York. She stepped out wearing an expensive business suit and heels completely unsuitable for mountain terrain. She looked around at the property with an expression George couldn't read. Shock maybe, or disbelief. Linda stood by her car for a long moment before walking toward them. Margaret's hands were still on the wet shirt she had been hanging. George slowly stood up from where he had been weeding. Neither of them moved toward Linda. They just waited. Linda stopped about 10 feet away. She looked older than George remembered. There were lines around her eyes and mouth. Gray in her hair. She was 38 now. An adult who had made adult choices. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. Then she said she had seen the news coverage, had read the articles, had seen Lisa's photographs. She said she couldn't believe it was them, couldn't believe what they had done. George asked why she was here. His voice was flat, empty of emotion. Linda flinched like he had slapped her. She said she wanted to apologize, said she was sorry for abandoning them, for not being there when they needed her, for being selfish and cruel. The words came out in a rush like she had been practicing them. Margaret set down the laundry basket and walked over to stand next to George. She looked at Linda with eyes that showed nothing. No anger, no warmth, just a calm assessment. Margaret said yes, Linda had abandoned them. Had abandoned them when George was sick and scared. Had abandoned them when they were old and alone. There was no emotion in Margaret's voice, just facts. Linda started crying. She said she knew, said she had been horrible, said she wanted to make it right. George asked how she planned to do that. Linda said she had money now. Her law practice was very successful. She could invest in the property, buy them equipment, hire help, make their lives easier. George almost laughed. He said they didn't need her money, didn't need equipment, didn't need help. They had built this place themselves. Every board and nail, every system and solution, without her, without any of their children. Margaret added that they were doing just fine. Better than fine. They had discovered they were capable of far more than they ever imagined. And they had done it alone. The word alone hung in the air like an accusation, because it was an accusation. A statement of fact that cut deeper than any anger could. Linda looked around the property again, really seeing it this time. The beautiful cabin with its solar panels, the thriving gardens, the workshop, the root cellar entrance, the water system, the fruit trees. Everything was well maintained and functional. Her parents, who she had written off as old and helpless, had created something she couldn't even comprehend creating with all her education and money. They had been tested by abandonment and had not just survived but triumphed. While she had been advancing her career and ignoring their calls, they had been building a paradise. The contrast was devastating. Linda asked what she could do to earn their forgiveness. Margaret said she didn't know if that was possible. Too much time had passed. Too much hurt had been left unaddressed. They had needed her 2 years ago. Now they didn't need her at all. George said Linda was welcome to visit during their public workshops. First Saturday of every month. She could come learn like everyone else. But she shouldn't expect special treatment. Shouldn't expect them to pretend the past didn't happen. Linda looked stricken. She had probably hoped for a tearful reunion, for instant forgiveness, for everything to go back to normal. But there was no normal to go back to. The relationship they once had was dead, killed by years of neglect. Whatever relationship they built now would have to be new, based on reality, not obligation, based on respect, not duty. George and Margaret were offering her a chance, but only the same chance they offered everyone else. No more, no less. Linda asked if she could at least see what they had built. Margaret gestured for her to follow. They walked around the property with Margaret explaining the systems. The spring water collection, the solar power, the gardens, the preservation techniques. Linda asked questions, some about the technical details, some about how they had learned to do all this. Margaret answered matter-of-factly. She wasn't cold, but she wasn't warm either. She was treating Linda like she would treat any visitor, polite but distant. At the workshop, George showed Linda the furniture he built, the tools he had collected, the projects he was working on. Linda touched a chair he had made. She said it was beautiful. George said thank you and nothing else. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. All the words that should have been said years ago had nowhere to go now. Before Linda left, she tried again to apologize. She said she knew words weren't enough, that she had failed them as a daughter, that she would do anything to make it right. George told her the truth. He said they had needed her to be there when they were scared and alone in the city. Needed her to care, needed her to call, but she hadn't. And that absence had forced them to find strength they didn't know they had, forced them to save themselves. In a strange way, Linda's abandonment had given them this life, this purpose, this paradise. If she had stayed involved, they might still be in that apartment slowly fading away. So George said he didn't know if he was angry anymore, or grateful, or just indifferent. He honestly didn't know what he felt. Margaret said she felt the same way. The pain had faded. What was left was just emptiness where their relationship used to be. Linda drove away an hour after arriving. George and Margaret watched the sedan disappear down the dirt road. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Margaret went back to hanging laundry. George returned to the garden. Life continued. The work didn't stop because of emotional visits. That night they talked about whether Linda would actually come to a workshop. Margaret thought she would. Linda had always been proud. Coming back as a regular visitor would be humiliating for her, but maybe that was what she needed. To understand that she had no special claim on their love anymore, that she would have to earn back every bit of trust she had destroyed. George said if she came, she would learn something valuable. The same thing all their visitors learned. That real relationships were built on presence and effort, not blood or legal documents. 2 weeks later, Patrick called. Then Kenneth sent an email. Both of them had heard about the property through Linda. Both wanted to visit. George responded the same way he had responded to Linda. They were welcome at the monthly workshops. Nothing more. Patrick argued. Said he was their son. Said he deserved a private conversation. George said Patrick had given up that right when he stopped taking their calls, when his secretary had dismissed George as a solicitor, when he had chosen his business over his parents. Patrick got angry, said George was being unfair, was holding grudges. George said he wasn't holding grudges. He was just stating facts. Patrick had made choices. Those choices had consequences. Now he would have to live with them. George hung up. He felt surprisingly calm. 3 years ago, that conversation would have devastated him, would have sent him to bed crying. Now it was just business. Just setting boundaries with people who had proven they couldn't be trusted. Margaret said she was proud of him. Said he had handled it perfectly. Not mean, not emotional, just clear. George said he was proud of her too. Said they had both grown so much, become so much stronger. The mountain had taught them that. Samuel Morton's legacy had taught them that. They didn't need the approval or love of people who had rejected them. They had each other. They had their work. They had hundreds of visitors who appreciated what they had to offer. That was enough. More than enough. As they prepared dinner that evening, George realized something profound. He had spent his entire life trying to earn love from his children, sacrificing everything to make them happy, to give them opportunities. But love that had to be earned wasn't real love. It was a transaction, and he was tired of transacting. Margaret felt the same way. They had given everything to 3 people who took it all and walked away. Now they were giving to people who actually valued what they received. The difference was night and day. That Saturday was a workshop day. 15 people came. Linda was one of them. She arrived early and stayed late. She worked hard, listened carefully, asked good questions. She didn't try to get special attention from George and Margaret. Didn't try to talk about family matters. She treated the day like the learning experience it was supposed to be. At the end, she thanked them along with everyone else and left without drama. George and Margaret discussed it later. Margaret said Linda was trying. Actually trying. Not just apologizing, but changing her behavior. It was a start. Maybe not enough to rebuild what was broken, but a start. George agreed. He said time would tell. If Linda kept showing up, kept making effort. 3 years after finding the ruined cabin, George and Margaret were sitting in a meeting they never imagined they would attend. The conference room was in the Pine Ridge Town Hall. Around the table sat representatives from a conservation trust, a sustainable living nonprofit, and several local officials. Everyone was there to discuss George and Margaret's proposal to protect the property permanently. The couple had spent months researching how to ensure their land would never be developed or destroyed, how to preserve Samuel Morton's legacy and their own work for future generations. The answer was a conservation easement combined with an educational foundation. It was complicated legal work that required lawyers and accountants and paperwork. But it was necessary. The Conservation Trust would hold the easement, ensuring the property could never be subdivided or commercially developed. The land would remain wild and intact forever. The Educational Foundation would manage programs on the property teaching sustainable living skills. George and Margaret would serve as directors during their lifetimes. After they passed, a board of trustees would continue the work. The foundation would be funded by donations and workshop fees. It would offer free intensive training programs for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. People like Samuel Morton had been after the Civil War. People like George and Margaret had been when they arrived broken and desperate. People who needed a second chance and practical skills to build better lives. The meeting went well. Everyone supported the plan. The Conservation Trust had actually approached George and Margaret about the easement after reading their story. They said the property was ecologically significant and culturally important. It represented a model of sustainable land use that needed to be preserved and studied. The local officials were supportive too. The workshops brought people to Pine Ridge who spent money at local businesses. The foundation would bring more. Plus, everyone in town was proud of what George and Margaret had accomplished. They had turned an eyesore into an asset, had put Pine Ridge on the map for positive reasons. The mayor said the town would support the foundation however they could, would help publicize it, would provide volunteers if needed. After the meeting, George and Margaret drove back to the property in silence. They were both thinking about what came next. The foundation meant opening their lives even more than they already had. Meant hosting longer programs. Meant teaching more people. It would be a lot of work. But it felt right. Samuel Morton had left them instructions for survival. Now they would leave instructions and training for others. The cycle would continue. The mountain would keep teaching. The legacy would live on beyond their lifetimes. That night they updated Samuel's journal. George wrote about the foundation, about the conservation easement, about their hopes for the future. He wrote that Samuel's 5 acres would now serve people forever, would teach them what he and Grace had learned through hardship, what George and Margaret had learned through abandonment and rebirth, that you could start from nothing and build something meaningful. That age was no barrier, that the land would support you if you learned to work with it instead of against it. The genealogical research had been Margaret's idea. She wondered if any descendants of Samuel and Grace Morton still existed. If they knew about the property their ancestors had homesteaded. A volunteer genealogist from one of the workshops took on the project. 6 months later, she returned with remarkable findings. Samuel and Grace had 3 children who survived to adulthood. Those children had children. The family tree had grown and spread across the country. There were dozens of living descendants. Most had no idea their ancestors had homesteaded in the Appalachians. The genealogist had contacted several of them. 8 relatives agreed to visit the property, to see what Samuel and Grace had built, to meet George and Margaret who had restored it. The reunion was emotional and powerful. The descendants arrived on a warm September day, ages ranging from 25 to 80, different skin tones and backgrounds because the family had mixed and blended over generations, but all of them shared Samuel and Grace as ancestors. George and Margaret gave them a tour of the property, showed them the cabin Samuel had built, the spring he had found, the root cellar he had dug, the fruit trees he had planted. They showed them Samuel's journal and the documents buried in the metal box. Several descendants cried reading Samuel's words, touching the same pages he had touched over a century ago. An elderly woman named Claire said she had always been told her great-great-grandfather had been a farmer. But nobody knew details. Nobody knew the full story. Now she understood where she came from, what her ancestor had overcome, the strength that ran in her blood. George and Margaret announced the foundation during that visit. They explained that the property would be protected forever, that it would continue teaching people just as it had taught them. They said Samuel and Grace's legacy would live on through education and conservation. The descendants were overwhelmed with gratitude. Several offered donations to the foundation. Others said they would volunteer. One young man named Andre was a teacher in Chicago. He said he wanted to bring students to the property, to show them what was possible, to connect them with their history. George and Margaret said the foundation would welcome school groups, would offer special programs for young people of color who needed to see themselves as part of this legacy of strength and self-reliance. The first class of foundation students arrived the following summer. 8 young people aged 18 to 25. They came from difficult backgrounds. Some had been in foster care, some had been homeless, some were recovering from addiction. All of them had applied for the program because they wanted to change their lives, wanted to learn skills, wanted a fresh start. The program was 6 months long. Students lived on the property in small cabins they would help build. They worked alongside George and Margaret, learning everything: sustainable agriculture, natural building, water systems, solar power, food preservation, financial literacy, life skills. But more than techniques, they learned philosophy. That hard work healed trauma, that self-reliance built confidence, that you could overcome any background if you refused to quit. Carlos was one of the first students. He had aged out of foster care at 18 with nothing, no family, no support, no skills. He had been living in his car when he found out about the foundation program. He applied not really believing he would be accepted. When the acceptance letter came, he cried for an hour. The program changed his life. George taught him carpentry and construction. Margaret taught him gardening and cooking. But more importantly, they believed in him, treated him with respect, expected him to succeed. By the end of 6 months, Carlos had built his own tiny cabin on the property, had learned to grow food and preserve it, had saved money from the small stipend the foundation provided. He left the program with skills, confidence, and hope. He got a job with a construction company, rented an apartment, started building a real life. He wrote to George and Margaret every month, updating them on his progress. They kept every letter, put them in a box alongside Samuel's journal. These were the success stories that mattered, the lives that were being changed. Not every student succeeded. 2 dropped out of the first program. The work was too hard, the isolation too challenging. They went back to cities and old patterns. George and Margaret felt sad about that, but not guilty. They couldn't save everyone, could only offer opportunities. What people did with those opportunities was up to them. Most students completed the program. Most went on to build better lives. Some stayed in touch. Some disappeared, but all of them left with something valuable. Skills they could use, confidence they had earned. Proof that they were capable of more than they thought. That was worth every bit of effort George and Margaret put into teaching them. Linda kept coming to workshops, month after month. She never missed one. She worked hard, learned genuinely. Over time, George and Margaret began to soften toward her. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. Linda had made mistakes, had been cruel through absence, but she was trying to change, actually changing. That deserved acknowledgement. Patrick came twice, then stopped. He sent money instead. Kenneth never came at all, but donated annually to the foundation. George and Margaret accepted the money and noted the difference. Linda was rebuilding a relationship through presence. Patrick and Kenneth were trying to buy forgiveness through money. Only one of those approaches had any chance of working. Only one showed real understanding of what they had done wrong. The foundation began graduating students. They held ceremonies where participants shared what they had learned. Many spoke about George and Margaret not as teachers, but as proof. Proof that your past didn't define your future, that being abandoned didn't make you worthless, that age didn't mean inability, that 2 people with nothing could build everything. These testimonials were powerful. Several were filmed and put online. The foundation's reputation grew. Applications poured in. Donations increased. Other organizations reached out wanting to replicate the model. George and Margaret were becoming known in sustainable living and social service circles. People wanted them to speak at conferences. 5 years after arriving at the ruined mountain cabin, George Williams woke up before dawn as he always did. He was 73 years old, but his body moved with the ease of someone decades younger. He dressed quietly while Margaret still slept. Outside the cabin, the mountain air was cool and clean. He walked through the property, checking on things as the sun began to rise. The garden beds were ready for fall planting. The solar batteries were fully charged. Water flowed steadily from the spring. The workshop was organized and stocked. Everything was functioning exactly as it should. George paused at the highest point of the property and looked out over what they had created. The transformed cabin, the productive gardens, the student cabins, the paths connecting everything. It was more than a homestead now. It was an institution, a living school, a testament to what 2 people could accomplish when they refused to accept defeat. Margaret joined him with 2 cups of coffee. She was 71 and radiant with health. Her hair was completely white now, but her face showed contentment rather than age. They stood together watching the sun paint the mountains gold and orange. This had become their morning ritual, standing here, drinking coffee, appreciating what they had built. They didn't talk much during these moments. Didn't need to. After 46 years of marriage, they could communicate in silence. George thought about the scared, desperate couple who had arrived here 5 years ago, broken and abandoned, barely able to imagine surviving, let alone thriving. Those people seemed like strangers now. The mountain had burned away their weakness, had revealed strength they never knew existed, had given them purpose when the world had decided they were useless. The foundation was thriving beyond their expectations. They had graduated 3 classes of students. 24 young people total who had completed the 6-month program. Most were doing well, building careers, creating stable lives. Several had started their own small homesteads. Others had gone into construction or agriculture or teaching. All of them stayed in touch, sent photos and updates, thanked George and Margaret for changing their lives. The 4th class was currently in residence. 6 students this time. The cabins were at capacity. George and Margaret had decided to keep the program small. Quality over quantity. Better to truly change 6 lives than to halfway help 20. The students were out in the garden now. George could see them working in the morning light, learning to plant fall crops, learning patience and observation, learning that growth took time and attention. The workshops continued monthly. They were always full, People came from across the country, even from other countries sometimes. Engineers wanting to study their systems, teachers wanting to learn their methods, elderly people wanting proof that age was not a prison, young people wanting alternatives to conventional life paths. Every workshop was different, but the core message was always the same. You can build a good life with your own hands. You can recover from anything. You are stronger than you think. George and Margaret had become elders in the truest sense. Not just old but wise. Not just knowledgeable but proven. They had walked through fire and come out stronger. That gave them authority no classroom education could provide. Linda had been coming to every workshop for 2 years. She never missed one. She had learned to garden, to preserve food, to build simple structures. She volunteered to help with the student program. Did administrative work for the foundation. She was trying to be useful rather than trying to be forgiven. George and Margaret had developed something like friendship with her. Not the unconditional parent-child love they once felt. That was gone. But respect, affection earned through consistent effort. Linda understood she would never fully repair what she had broken. But she was building something new, something honest. Patrick had stopped coming after a few attempts. He sent money quarterly and called on holidays. The conversations were polite but distant. Kenneth had never visited at all. Just donations. George and Margaret accepted what each of their former children was willing to give. They no longer needed more, no longer felt the pain of rejection. Those relationships had found their natural levels. Some people could change, some couldn't. That was life. George spent his afternoons in the workshop now. He was building furniture for a gallery in Asheville. His pieces sold well. Simple, functional designs made from local wood. Each piece was signed and came with a card explaining the property and foundation. Some customers donated to the foundation after buying furniture. George didn't make much money, but that was fine. The foundation covered their living expenses. The furniture sales paid for extras, tools, materials, gifts for the students. He enjoyed the work. The smell of wood, the satisfaction of creating something that would last. He thought about Samuel Morton often while working. Wondered if Samuel had built furniture here too. Probably. People in the 1890s made everything themselves. George felt connected to that tradition. Connected to every person who had ever worked with their hands to build something useful. Margaret spent her afternoons teaching. She had become an expert in medicinal herbs and sustainable gardening. Students came specifically to learn from her. She was patient and thorough. She explained not just what to do but why, the underlying principles that made systems work. She had learned all of this through experimentation and failure, through reading and observation, through listening to the land. Now she could pass it forward, could save others from making the same mistakes, could accelerate their learning. She thought about Grace Morton sometimes, wondered what Grace had taught her own children. Probably the same things Margaret was teaching now. How to read weather, how to preserve food, how to use plants for healing. The knowledge was timeless. Only the specific techniques changed. The wisdom underneath remained constant across generations. Evenings were for sitting on the porch. George and Margaret had made this their sacred time. After dinner, they would sit in chairs George had built and watch the day end. Students were welcome to join them, but many chose to give the couple privacy. They understood George and Margaret needed time alone together. Their relationship was the foundation everything else was built on. The love between them had deepened through shared hardship. They had saved each other's lives by refusing to quit, by working together, by believing in each other when the world had stopped believing in them. That bond was unbreakable now. Tested by fire and proven pure, George asked Margaret if she ever regretted coming here. Regretted giving up the comfort of city life. Margaret laughed. She said the city had been comfortable like a coffin was comfortable, soft and still and dead. The mountain was challenging, but it was alive. Every day brought new problems to solve, new lessons to learn, new growth to celebrate. She said she had learned more in 5 years here than in the previous 66 years combined. Had discovered capabilities she never knew existed. Had found purpose beyond serving others. George agreed completely. He said he had spent his whole life feeling small, feeling like his worth came from what he could provide to his children and employers. Here he had discovered his worth came from within, from his character, his determination, his willingness to keep showing up no matter how hard it got. They talked about death sometimes. Not morbidly, but practically. They were in their 70s. Healthy, but not immortal. They had maybe 10 or 15 years left if they were lucky. What would happen to the property after they died? The foundation would continue. The board of trustees would manage it. The conservation easement guaranteed the land would never be developed. But George and Margaret wouldn't be here to see it. Wouldn't know if their work continued to matter. Margaret said she had made peace with that. They had done what they could. Had planted seeds that would grow long after they were gone. The measure of a life wasn't how long you lived, but what you built that outlasted you. By that measure, their lives were successful. The foundation would teach hundreds of people over the coming decades. The land would remain protected for centuries. Samuel Morton's legacy would continue. That was enough. More than enough. A group of students approached the porch as the sun touched the horizon. They asked if George and Margaret would tell them about the beginning. About finding the cabin in ruins. About the first terrible months. About discovering Samuel's journal. The couple exchanged glances. They had told this story hundreds of times. But it never got old. Because it was true. Because it mattered. Because it gave people hope. George began talking. About being abandoned. About the desperate drive to the mountains. About their first night in the tent wondering if they had made a fatal mistake. Margaret added details. The cold, the pain, the fear, the moments when they almost quit. The students listened with rapt attention. These young people had their own stories of hardship. Their own moments of despair. They needed to know someone else had felt that way and survived. Had done more than survive. Had triumphed. George ended the story the way he always did. He said the worst thing that ever happened to them had become the best thing. Being abandoned had set them free. Free to discover their true strength. Free to build a life based on their own values. Free to help others without obligation or resentment. The students nodded. Several had tears in their eyes. They understood.